Earlier today, which at the time of writing was Valentine's Day, I was watching an Australian horror film called Relic. It's a pretty decent flick, and don't worry, I won't spoil it for those who are interested in seeing it, but there was a period of time during the film, as it ramped up in intensity, where the walls began to close in on a character, and the sounds being made were the horrifically exaggerated creaking and groaning of the house. Something small, something everyday that every house experiences at some point or another. I used to live in a 400-year-old pub, and believe me, old houses like to mess with you that way. That noise in itself evokes unpleasant feelings of claustrophobia, of the ordinary made unnatural and twisted. And I love that kind of horror. Take something simple, something we're all used to, and make it terrifying. It's something that Freud referred to as the unheimlich, or uncanny, the natural made profoundly unnatural. This is something that's pervasive throughout Little Nightmares too, and it remains the thing I appreciate the most about the game. That overwhelming sensation that everything should be normal, but it just isn't. There are houses, streets, cobblestone pathways. The homes are furnished and personalised, obviously lived in and sometimes even inhabited. But there's always something not quite right about them. The doorways are a little too large, the floors just a little too sunken. The clotheslines that hang between apartments have entire outfits slumped over them. Bar stools still have the echoes of their patrons perched upon them. It's almost as if the rapture has swept through town and all that's left behind are the threads of unnaturally tall and thin people. That sensation of feeling impossibly small and insignificant was something I praised in the original, a game that I had mixed feelings on at the time, both loving its atmosphere and art design, but simultaneously despising its frustrating controls and occasionally obnoxious timings. And it's safe to say that Little Nightmares 2 is an equally impressive game. At once both small and unassuming, yet grand and threatening, it expands the minimalist horizons of its predecessor from the depths of the moor to the entirety of an eerily still haunted city. You play as Mono, a young boy who awakens in the middle of a wooded grove, and whose only option is to move forward. Along the way you come across a young girl who, although apprehensive at first, eventually joins Mono for the majority of his journey into the centre of a dead city. The marketing has made no secret of the fact that this girl is 6, the player character from the original game, but how exactly her appearance here ties into the original is something I won't go into. I will say that the game's story is an absolute blast, far more intriguing and explorative of many terrible twisted themes. With the way the game absolutely oozes intense and dark atmosphere from its every pore, it's a given that the story itself should be equally as powerful. There are layers upon layers of fantastic world building to Little Nightmares 2, and it is undoubtedly a vastly superior game to its predecessor. Insidious detail swarm it, from the distant lights of a broadcast tower to the peeling wallpaper and rotten, decaying homes you stumble through. Every inch of this game is permeated by a theatrical unpleasantness, and there were plenty of times where the intended effect was achieved. I felt such strong dread in many of the game's areas that I surprised myself, and in this regard, Little Nightmares 2 is impressive. What's more, whilst you might think that the inclusion of a second character would make this an escort quest, you needn't worry, there is no escorting required. 6 is a self-sufficient character whose simple and elegant design makes her quirky personality a joy to watch. Although most of the time she will just follow Mono around, helping him with a boost or catching his hand across long jumps, she isn't just there to help with the odd gap. If Mono messes around in a room, she will join in, picking up objects like toys, scuffing her feet across the ground, and if you close the distance and call for her, you can make the two of them hold hands. And in some of the game's most atmospherically impressive moments, where the enormity of the city looms over you, there's something oddly heartwarming about seeing these two unlikely companions clutch one another's hand and hurry onwards. Like the original, the game populates its twisted landscapes with similarly ungodly denizens. Where the original had the grotesque chef twins with their flesh masks and the beauty-obsessed geisha, Little Nightmares 2 features every primary school child's nightmare in the teacher who sees all, every patient's nightmare of the doctor feverishly trying to perfect his creations, the faceless menace of the television and the echoes of those ensnared by its trap. Much of what's on display here is the absolute best that I've seen in any horror game in a long, long while, and the way that Tarsier Studios taps into base and primal fears The horror of the unnatural, the unknown, the diseased is once again outstanding, far more so than its predecessor in essentially every single way. Of particular note is the sound design and the soundtrack itself, both of which are outstanding. Speaking about them doesn't feel like it would do them much justice, since sound design is one of those things that's easy to miss when it's just mediocre or not bad enough to really be noticeable. But of all the things I paid attention to in this game, the sound design was absolutely one of them. Every little noise, every atmospheric drone, every single solitary moment of sound was pitch perfect. It was, quite frankly, the best thing about the game. But, and this is a big but, I cannot lie, the game has problems. Intensely frustrating problems that almost ruin the entire experience, which is in and of itself disappointing, given that the biggest problem with the original game was just how irritating some of its timings could be. I made no secret of this in my review of the original, but one of my many litany of problems is a struggle with depth perception, and this was massively exacerbated by the game's use of a 3D control scheme on what is ostensibly a 2D plane. Essentially, for those unaware, you have full analog control of your character, but the background itself is largely flat and static. The camera only moves on once you have side-scrolled to the next section of the game. Traditional 2.5D games in the vein of Limbo, Inside, or roguelikes such as Rogue Legacy will have a fixed 2D movement scheme, up, down, left, right. With Little Nightmares, whenever you make a jump you have to accommodate for the exact angle that you've jumped at and the location of the platform you're attempting to reach. This isn't necessarily a huge problem, and for the majority of the game I only really struggled with this on a small number of occasions. Irritating as they weren't a deal breaker, and the checkpoint system is fairly liberal, so it's rare you'll be replaying large chunks of the game over and over. Unlike something like Outlast 2, the end goal is always clear and in sight, it's just a matter of timing. There are some fiddly timings on certain things. Chase sequences, for example, have an obnoxious habit of coming down to the absolute wire, with literal microseconds often meaning the difference between escape and instant death. But these are only minor grievances that echo issues I had with the first game. The problem is, they aren't limited to platforming. You see, for some reason, somebody at Tarsier Studios decided to incorporate combat into a 2.5D game where one hit from anything will kill you. Games like this are built on trial and error systems. Limbo was an absolute prime example of this, and indeed it's expected that you die, because not only is that how you learn, but it's also reflective of the game's themes. Dying in Limbo is nowhere near as frustrating as dying in that one particularly egregious section of Little Nightmares, because it's usually a matter of correctly ordering the sequence of events to progress. Limbo makes a puzzle out of its instant death scenarios rather than a matter of timing. Little Nightmares 2 takes all the minor frustrations of its imperfect control scheme and millisecond timings and bundles them all up into the added fury of swinging a hammer or a pipe towards an enemy who is hurtling towards you. There is a singular perfect example of this that takes place in the school, and I'll just play the footage on the screen and speed it up to illustrate just how obnoxious this can be. I understand that some people might not have an issue with these sequences, but for someone who already struggles with depth perception, these were the absolute bane of my existence. This particular section took me around 15 minutes because the timings were so imperfect. The enemies would sometimes interrupt a swing and sometimes not, and on occasion the weapon would just swing straight through the damn things. It's been a while since I've been this frustrated with something, and I had a Binding of Isaac run the other day where I still had base Isaac damage on the goddamn chest. But Jack, I hear you say, there was combat in the original, this is just expanded. No, wrong, bad imaginary commenter that I've just made up. There was a single boss battle in which literally all you had to do was pick up a mirror and point it at the enemy. Otherwise, progressing was just a matter of picking your moment and running. You can't learn from being one-shot by an enemy. All the enemies in these sections have different timings, meaning that getting through these areas isn't a matter of skill and patience, it's a matter of muscle memory. You are forced to repeat the process over and over again until you are absolutely pitch perfect. And that should not be a thing you are made to do in a game that is basically a side-scroller. What's worse about it is that this is only really a major issue in the school, which is at around the 1/3 mark of the game. There was a lot of chatter in the game's Steam forums about the hospital area being far worse, but I actually found that considerably easier for one simple reason. The enemies that you are forced to fight in the hospital have a grace period. If you miss, you still have a little time to get in another swing. That is all they needed to do in the school, just make it so that the enemies jump backwards and have to wind up their attack again if you miss. It's bizarre that this effort was made in the hospital, but not the school. Unfortunately, there's also a far more egregious example of this horrible game mechanic. Without wishing to delve too deeply into spoilers, there is a final boss that features a series of increasingly difficult rooms, in which the goal is to reach a certain object and hit it with an axe. It doesn't sound too bad on paper, but believe me, this was one of 2 times in the game where I was so infuriated by the sketchy hitboxes of the boss's Bloodborne-style flailing attacks that I had to turn the game off before I launched a monitor through the drywall. And the worst thing about this is that the penultimate boss, if you can really call it that, is an absolutely fantastic sequence that I fell in love with, reincorporating multiple elements of the game leading up to that point, as well as giving you an oh my god moment when you actually finish the game. That said, this game's other biggest problem is that, just like the original, it is far too expensive. Little Nightmares retails at £16 for 3-ish hours of content. Not accounting for the obscene amount of time I spent replaying certain sections, Little Nightmares 2 clocks in at between 4 to 5 hours and it retails at £25. £25! If you buy the Digital Deluxe edition, it's £35. And what do you get in the Digital Deluxe? The soundtrack, a 2 to 3 minute additional section of gameplay entitled The Attic, and a new hat for Mono to wear. It's not worth the price of admission on the soundtrack alone, because as good as it is, it's not really the sort of music you'd listen to outside of the game unless you're Stephen King. Listen, I love Inside, I love it to death, it is my favourite of all these side-scrolling platformers, but is it too expensive at £15 for the 2 hours of playtime you get out of it? Absolutely. It was recently £3.74 in the Steam Lunar New Year sale and tends to go on sale at this price every time it's included in one. And for that cost, go nuts! Inside is a fantastic game, and Little Nightmares 2 is a fantastic game if you strip out the terrible combat. But when a game like Valheim is released into early access with a £15 price tag and an obscene amount of content to sink your teeth into, it feels criminal that a game like Little Nightmares can get away with demanding Kenshi levels of money from you. What it comes down to with Little Nightmares 2 is all a matter of how tolerant you are for frustration. If looking at my footage of the school hallway sequence made you want to scream, you may wish to just watch someone else play it. I do think, however, that this would be a disservice to the game, and in all honesty, I'm conflicted. So much of this game is fantastic, and if it weren't for the hideous combat mechanics and how pervasive it is throughout the game, I would be recommending it with raucous aplomb. Instead, this is a cautious recommendation for those who don't have any issues with depth perception or don't mind having to replay sections where death is caused through no fault of your own. As it stands, Little Nightmares 2 is a masterclass in atmosphere, design and tension, let down by obnoxious combat and unreasonable difficulty spikes. If Tarsier can take into account the criticisms of both games, the slippery controls and the dismal combat, and marry the best of them, then Little Nightmares 3 could be something truly special. I'll leave you on this one final thought. Of the 2 new releases I played in January, Little Nightmares 2 is the one that had the most impact on me, being as thought-provoking as it was gorgeous. And as for the other, oh, we'll get to that in due course.
I'll never get used to this. Nope. Doesn't work. Ugh. I hate to think what kind of photos need this much secrecy.
Please just stop talking.
Okay. I know how this works. I need 3
Please.
liquids to develop the photo.